And we're back. Welcome back to the How to Draw HD Remix tutorial. Again, if you've been with us, we've been studying how to create this comic character or any character or illustration that you want to in Adobe Illustrator. So we're going to continue forward with where we left off. And the last time we spoke, we talked about coloring. So we talked about different ways that you could color using the brush tools, pencil, pen tools, as well as different ways to color using live paint and other features. Okay, so now that you've gotten your color laid down, and as you can see, mine is here and it's pretty basic. But the reason I did that is because the majority of Ghost Rider's clothing is basically duotone. Like, there are only really two colors. You have the color of his jacket and his spikes, and then the rest is like the flames and the skull. So it's not that complicated. So you'll see, as I have here, there are just very, very few colors that I'm using. In total, actually, if you look at my swatches library, I have 6 colors that I'm using in total. So, and some of these aren't even actually active colors. They were alternate colors that I was going to use in case I wanted to test something different out. So, we're going to move forward and talk about shading. And when we think about shading, we have to think about how our workflow goes. And the most important thing in adding form to your piece is to do shading and highlighting. Now, you may or may not work with one before the other. Like, some people like to work with highlights and then apply the shading, which may be an easier route because then you're just dropping in your light sources and you know where the shading goes. Or some people may just prefer to attack the shading first, because for me, typically I add more details when I'm doing the shading than when I'm just dropping the light source, because the light sources, they tend to diffuse, and what will happen is you'll get stronger shading in shadow areas to add more depth to your piece. So we have to first look at what I did with my piece. And so I'm going to turn on the shading layer that I created. And this is what he looks like with all of the shading turned on. I can turn it off and show you again. Now in the end, I still have my ink layer on, but I'm going to end up turning that off, and this is what it will look like. And then you can see what it looks like with and without the shading and the ink. And then we can add it back just so you can see placement. Now, there are, again, several types of shading techniques that you can use. So we're going to get rid of the shading for now. We're going to create a new layer. And in that new layer, I'm going to show you, not necessarily on the character, I will place some on the character, but I'm going to show you on an actual separate object how shading works. So we're going to create a circle. And let's make it a, matter of fact, let's make it a magenta circle. Actually, let's darken it a little bit, just a little. All right. Now, the first thing you want to figure out is where your light source is coming from. So let's say we are thinking of creating a light source, and that light source direction is going to come down from the upper right. Okay? And let me just make this clearer. I'm going to change this into, let's see, an arrowhead, so you can see where it's coming from. All right. So this is essentially going to be our light source coming from that direction. So we're talking about the light source is hitting right in this area. Let me just get rid of this mark, get it out the way. But we're talking about right in this area. This is where the light source is going to hit. So you know that anything beyond that in this area is really where your shading is going to be. So you're going to have your light source right here, and then you're going to have your shading right here. All right? So you know they're going to work together, and it's going to be a blend depending upon how hard it's hitting or the contours of the surface. Because this is a circle or a sphere, since it's going to be in 3D form, we're actually going to have a smooth gradient around it, and then you'll see how the light diffuses across the shape. So if we go and we consider just the shading itself, we know that one of the things we can do is create a darker area along this side of the actual sphere. So um, let's try the first basic technique. We can try adding a shape of a darker color. Now, when you add shapes, the only problem with adding a shape is you're going to have a hard contoured line. So you can use the pen tool, you use the pencil tool, or you can use the brush tool, and you can actually paint or draw across that shape. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pen tool and I'm going to create a shape that just gives me an area around my shape, around the sphere, that can be representative of the shadowed area. Now, right now you're looking at it and it's pretty much over the bounds of the actual shape. Now, the way to compensate for that is to use your Pathfinder tool. So I would select the shape, the sphere, and copy it. I would then select the shadow shape, paste the copy of the sphere behind it, and then hold the Shift key and select that shadow shape again. Go to our Pathfinder window and only include the overlapping shape. That now gives me the precise shape that will be the shadow area for this sphere. And then what we can do is we can go to the swatches panel or our color panel and we can change the amount of black that's in that shape. And now we have a shaded area. You also can change the blending mode, like let's say we have a more bluish or a purplish kind of color that's attached to it. What we can do is we can change its blending mode to multiply or darken, and it will begin to take on the colors that are underneath it. And you can change the opacity or opacity down to whatever you want, and then you have the shading again. That's a technique with a hard shape. Again, you can do that with the brush tool if you decided to brush it on, and then you can do the same thing, change it to multiply, change the opacity. You can do the same thing with, let's say, the pencil tool. You could create a shape, same thing, change its blending mode, etc., etc. Still using the Pathfinder tools if the shapes actually overlap, so that way you can keep them within the bounds of the actual sphere or your shape of your actual illustration. Now, that's with the pen tool, pencil tool, and blob brush, or regular brush if you decided to use that. The other way to do it is you can either copy this shape that's already there, or you can create a gradient on this shape. What I like to do is I like to copy it and then paste it in front, and then create a new gradient on that. That way I maintain the original appearance of the object below it. So I want to create, I'm going to get rid of this stroke that's on it, but I want to create some kind of shadow that falls similar to how we just saw. So we already know this is a sphere, so I would create a radial gradient. All right? And then you can use the G button on your keyboard, and this will allow you to reposition your actual gradient. You can grab the black circular marker and you can move your gradient to different areas, okay? And then you'll see how it readjusts. Now, we wanted this to be the dark area, so we're going to move it in this direction. And since the gradient is a smooth gradient, you'll notice just how smooth the transition is from light to dark. It looks like an actual light source is hitting it now. And you can always change the size and shape of this actual gradient independent of the actual object itself that you originally started with. So the gradient will conform to the dotted line marquee you see around here, and this will be the radius, and this line will govern from dark to light whatever colors you've selected in your actual gradient. And you can change it and scale it proportionately, or you can do it independently by grabbing this edge and moving it one way versus the other. All right. Now, if you wanted to, and you can do this within the gradient tool itself with the letter G, if you went over to your gradients panel, you could also double click or single click, but if you double click, it'll bring up your opacity slider, and you can change the swatches on it as well as the color blending mode so that you can get more options. Now, I could change this to a reddish color. Well, it's more pink now, but towards the red spectrum. Um, and you'll notice that it actually reflects it in the shape itself. All right. And then the black stays the same because we didn't change that. We can also change that if we wanted to. Same thing to another color. Like let's say we wanted a darker blue. And we can leave it like that. And then if we even wanted to go further, we can then go to the transparency panel, select multiply, and now it starts to take on the attributes of the color behind it. And now it looks more natural. And then you can decrease the opacity to get the level that you want. And now you have a more realistic appearing sphere. And this was also the reason why I left the sphere, the original shape, behind it. So that way when we did change it, if we decided to do a different color mode, it would take on the attributes of the actual sphere behind it. If you didn't do that, you would end up with something that looked like this if you changed the color mode. Because now it's not 100% opaque. The actual transparency is lowered, so it's not giving you full opacity. All right? So that's why we kept it the way that we had it. So that's essentially how you would do it with the gradient. Now, the next tool, and you can fiddle around with this. You can also change it to a linear gradient as well, but we only did this because we were doing a sphere, and now you see how it completely changes the overall look. It doesn't look as round as it does when you're using an actual radial gradient. All right, so you got to be careful and mindful what you're doing. On certain objects, using a linear gradient actually will work, especially if you're doing stuff like metal bands or things that have a more flat or rectangular shape. Then linear gradients work. So radial gradients mainly work on spherical or ovalesque objects. So let's get rid of this. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually, and this one you can actually, let's do the same thing again. Let's copy the sphere and paste it in front. And you may not have seen me do that, but I Command or Control C and Command or Control F to get it in front of the shape. And we're going to use a gradient mesh. Now with a gradient mesh, essentially what it is you're creating various points within this shape, and you can change each individual anchor point's color and their opacity independent of one another. And what it will do is create transitional gradients between each one of those. It will calculate it so that it does it a certain way. So that's the U button on your keyboard, or it looks like a leaf icon. It's the mesh tool. Looks like a leaf icon, but it's essentially a mesh with the different anchor points and different Bezier curves that are within it. So what I like to do is initially I like to figure out where my light source is, and I'll click that as my first point. And then I can work every other point around that. So what I'm going to do to make sure I don't accidentally select points from the object below it is I'm going to double click and isolate this object. I can then use the marquee tool and select the areas I want to be darker. And then I can change their actual color to a darker color. And that allows me, let's say we change this to, as you can see I'm doing them independent of one another, allows me to get the circular shape that I wanted. I can then go transparency panel, select multiply, and then change the opacity according to how I want. Same thing. So this is another means by which you can get your shading. And I guess one of the things I just want to advise you of is to be wary when you're doing this with the gradient mesh tool only, is because it doesn't always create the lines uniformly, especially if you have something that has a lot of anchor points. When you start to get to an object, like let's say it's an irregular object or something like this, sometimes you want to stay away from using that tool, because here's what happens. If I were to click here, you see how these lines get all screwy? And then you might click one there. Sometimes the lines jump completely outside of the actual shape itself. And what that'll do is, if I decided to change that color there, you'll notice that you're getting really, really harsh lines. So let's try another one. Change this to that, and Let's change this to like a yellow. And you see how this immediately you get this like sharp line right here. You have to be really, really careful. You can always manipulate these lines. And you know what? Let me just change the color for the layer itself. Let's change it to a dark green. All right. You can always change how they are positioned, but they don't vary that much because once it's calculated, it kind of sucks if you do it on an abnormal shape, and there's really no way around it. It'll still keep those harsh lines because it's doing it with respect to the original shape itself. So you just got to be careful. A way to compensate for that is to actually create individual shapes that are more simplistic or more organic, more round or more square or rectangular in shape, and then combine those into one larger shape, making sure you keep in mind where those gradient areas and areas of transparency may connect to one another across the actual shapes themselves. All right, so those are the main ways that you would create your shading in your piece. And then we're going to look at this, and this is how I created the shading with mine. You can combine different ways. You're not set to one way. In this one, I chose to use gradient mesh, regular gradient, as well as general hard shapes for harder shadows. You have to know whether your shadows are harsh or whether or not they're soft shadows. And depending upon which one they are, you can get away with hard shapes, or you can get away with more diffuse shading, which would use like the gradient mesh or the regular gradient tool. All right, so fool around, practice with it. Make sure you're outlining in the areas that you feel the shading is going to be. My light source is mainly coming from the upper right as well as from around the skull, so a lot of my light source is falling off under the muscle definition area, which you can see here. So that's why the majority of my shading is in that area. All right, and let's see. That's an even more clear view. I took off the color so you can see the actual shading lines themselves, and now you'll understand where these are actually falling into place in my piece. And then when I turn the color back on, you see it with it, and I can turn the shading off and you see it without it. All right, so just take your time, fool around with it, see which technique works best for you, and also keep in mind that shading types will vary depending upon the texture of the material, whether it's skin, clothing, different types of clothing. It could be leather, it could be cotton. You can have metal, like the spikes that are on his shoulder pads, and it's all going to reflect differently depending upon where it's hitting. All right, and also you can consider multiple light sources as well if you want to make it more dynamic. All right, so thanks again for joining me in this session. And the next session we will be talking about the highlighting, and I look forward to seeing you guys there. Take care.